Okay, buongiorno, everyone. Welcome to my session of Art History Encounters. Many of you know, my name is Elaine Ruffolo. I teach Renaissance art history here in Florence, and I'm in Florence right now. I've taught for Syracuse University, Stanford, many of the American programs here in Florence, as well as museum groups, and I've been lecturing for Tauck. Let's see, I think it's 26 years doing presentations for Tauck. And it's nice to see friends out there who I've had in my lectures in Florence as you've traveled through Italy. And I hope to see you very, very soon. My expertise is really teaching Renaissance art history on site, meaning in the streets and the piazzas and the museums, which obviously in the foreseeable future is on hold. And I have to say, I really admit I miss it. So I came up with this idea of doing art history encounters virtually. And it really fills my soul that you're all here. Honestly, I thought we would have maybe 30, 40 people, and I've lost count. I really have no idea how many. We must be in over 200 people easily. So that's a real testament to your passion as well, and I appreciate this. Tauck and I got together last week to have a chat, and I volunteered to do this presentation for them, knowing that it would fill my soul and hopefully satisfy something that you might be missing as well. Our common passion is, of course, art. So very quickly, just a few things. As Kevin, thank you, Kevin Barnett, again, for supporting me and helping me with the technology of this. And if any of you are having any problems, just take your cursor, hover down to the lower right, and you're able to send a message to Kevin with any kind of a problem. You can also send me messages. I'd love to know where you're from, or if you have questions, I will do my very best to answer them at the end. If I run out of time, I'll answer you via email a little bit later. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Oh, and a heartfelt thank you to all of you who have made a donation. The response that I gave you, you'll see my art history lectures are free, but if you feel so moved, you're welcome to make a donation and know that that donation will help keep my business afloat during these very difficult times. So thank you again. All right, so welcome, and now let's start our wonderful time with the notorious Caravaggio. Sex, slander, sodomy, pedophilia, violence, and murder. Caravaggio was accused of all these things, and most of them were actually true. He was notorious, violent, impetuous. I like to call him the James Dean of the 17th century, a bad boy, but a bad boy we love. What we know about Caravaggio is coming from his biographer, and his biographer's name was Giovanni Baglione, who despised him. So we always have to take what Giovanni Baglione says with a grain of salt. The other source that we have for Caravaggio is his incredibly long prison record. He's in and out of prison many different times, in and out of trouble. And we know that he was antisocial, he had a terrible temper, and in fact, he committed murder. He was both praised and despised, damned for his brutal naturalism and for painting things as he saw them. But what I'd like to reiterate to all of you is that Caravaggio restored naturalism after decades of flights of fancy that we call mannerism. He was like a bolt of lightning shooting through the 17th century, and yet he only lived 39 years. He died with no workshop, no students, and he influenced a whole generation of painters. It's really incredible. In order to best understand Caravaggio, we've got to put him into a historical context. So let me just digress for a moment and paint the picture for you. Caravaggio was born in a period that we call the Counter-Reformation, when a new spirit had taken over the Catholic Church after the initial shock of the Protestant Reformation. Let me remind you that it was a turbulent time just before Caravaggio was born. Have a look. These two popes, almost one after another, these are Medici popes. And the guy on your left, his name is Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. And you can see my cursor. He becomes Pope Clement VII. And the Pope in the chair is, of course, Leo X. And I bring them up because they were two of the most corrupt popes in history. They practiced simony, nepotism, indulgences. Leo would say, give me your money and I'll find a special place for you, or cut off your time in purgatory. Now, this corruption of the papacy does not go unheeded, because in fact, I'll remind you of history. Martin Luther pounds up 95 theses at Wittenberg Cathedral in 1517, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The fellow on your right, Henry VIII, he starts acts of supremacy in 1534, and he breaks off from the Roman Catholic Church to start the Church of England. And this is a huge spiritual as well as economic loss for the Catholic Church. Let me remind you, Rome is sacked in the year 1527. Under Charles V, who's the fellow on that great white horse, Charles V will invade Rome with Spanish and French troops and completely decimate the city. So we have religious upheaval, warfare, and the Catholic Church has got to deal with this. Okay, and that happens here. With this Pope, quite important, there's a painting by Titian, but just to illustrate who the Pope was, his name is Paul III. He was a Farnese Pope. And as I said, after the initial success of the Protestant Reformation, Pope Paul III is going to call the Council of Trent in 1545. All right, so under this Pope, the Catholic Church decided that the best defense was a well-planned offense, and they went into attack formation with the new order of the Jesuits leading the way. The official position of the church was stated in this thing called the Council of Trent, meeting on and off again between 1545 and 1565, and they reiterated church dogma, transubstantiation, the priesthood, celibacy, purgatory, and above all, the supreme authority of the Pope. The popes at this point called on artists to support this new idea through splendor and powerful images. That's why I brought this up, because the age of the Baroque, this incredible, exuberant art, is reflecting the period of the Counter-Reformation. And Rome becomes the place for artists to come with an incredible vivacity. Everyone's coming, getting commissions, they're following the money, and that's what's going on in Rome during this period of the Counter-Reformation. Then I wanted to illustrate some of the characteristics of the Baroque. So have a look at this list. Even though I usually hate reading from PowerPoints, I think this is important for everyone to understand, because it's the age that Caravaggio is coming out of. Emotion, move people now back to the Catholic fold. Religious fervor, clarity of narration, make it absolutely clear, no confusion in the way that art was during the Mannerist period. Make it splendid, as grand as possible. Illusionism, make people feel like they're participating. Dramatic light, and of course, lots of movement to bring people back to the Catholic fold. All right, that's your background, and that's the world that Caravaggio is coming into. Now here's our map of Italy, and if you look up at the top, you'll see this, the outline here in red. This is Lombardia, which is where Caravaggio comes from. His real name is Michelangelo Merisi, and I'm afraid that some of you were confused because I got all these wonderful responses saying, I can't wait to hear about Michelangelo. This lecture is not about Michelangelo Buonarroti. Maybe I'll do that next time. It's about Michelangelo Merisi, known as Caravaggio. And he's called Caravaggio, which refers to a village where his parents were born. He's born in 1571. His dad was a muratore, which means, you know, it's like one step up of a stonemason, one step down from an architect. And his father died when Caravaggio was only 6 years old. We know that Caravaggio apprenticed at the age of 15. He's in Milan, and he's working for this painter whose name is Simone Petrizzano, who's this feeble painter who likes to call himself a student of Titian. You know, it's like a bad combination of the worst of Titian and the worst of Michelangelo's stiff figures. So his training's not very, I mean, in terms of the technique Caravaggio is getting his training, in terms of inspiration, Petrizzano is going to leave a lot to be desired. But it's here that Caravaggio would have learned how to crush down pigments, make oil paint, prepare canvases, and he gets his real start. But the thing I wanted to bring up here is Caravaggio in his teens, he's in Milan, and there it is. I mean, wow. This is, of course, Leonardo's Last Supper, which was painted in 1498, and it was famous, even though later on it starts to flake off the wall. But during the age of Caravaggio, we presumably think he could have seen this. And, you know, Leonardo's softness, the kind of lights and darks that he does may have inspired Caravaggio. But an artist I thought was even more interesting for you to look at is this guy. This guy's name is Lorenzo Lotto. And I don't know why he's not as famous. He's not to other people besides art historians, but his beautiful paintings, very crisp line, this real attention to light and clarity, I think must have inspired Caravaggio. Let's get close. And you can take a look at, again, remember, Counter-Reformation art is supposed to be about clarity, no confusion, right? This idea of understanding the individuals. And notice these beautiful, heavily outlined figures. And when you take a look at this and compare it to Caravaggio's early work, which is called Rest on the Flight into Egypt, I can't help but see that there's a real correlation. Let me show you the close-up. Isn't she lovely? This is, of course, an image of the Virgin Mary. It's called Rest on the Flight into Egypt. She holds her child tenderly. There's a beautiful attention here to the neck of this beautiful young girl with her gorgeous red hair tied up closely, sleeping on the head. It's a very, very real looking image. And then we look over on the left-hand side. This is Joseph, of course. An interesting treatment here. Like Lotto, Caravaggio has emphasized the naturalism, the treatment of the trees. Also, you can even make out the musical notes that Joseph holds up in astonishment, because here's this angel who's just appeared to play music for the Holy Family. Notice also the way Caravaggio juxtaposes the face of Joseph with the donkey. You know, they're very innocent looking, the animal and this old man. So that's Caravaggio kind of, I think, understanding Northern art. Well, at the age of 20, he leaves for Rome. And here's the map of Italy once again. You can see between, of course, Lombardia coming down to Rome, what's in between? Florence. Now, I can't prove it, but I would assume that Caravaggio would have stopped in Florence. And the first place any artist would go in Florence would be the Brancacci Chapel. Some of you've been here. This is Masaccio's great fresco from 1427, which is actually the first place when quarantine is over. This is the very first place I'm going to head because I love this chapel. And when you look at the details here, for example, Masaccio paints this woman who's receiving alms from St. Peter. She's painted with great respect and dignity. Look at the way Caravaggio shows the child, Masaccio shows the child playing with the neck of the woman and playing with his own hair. And his cute little culetto, that adorable little diaperless child, is shown here so naturalistic. I can't help but think that that must have inspired Caravaggio with his realism. So anyway, he makes his way down to Rome. And here he is in Rome at the age of 20. 1592, what a place to be in Rome. However, Caravaggio was looking for money and he needed a patron because when he came to Rome, he was completely destitute. He doesn't have any money. He's a real nobody. He's destitute, kicking around from workshop to another workshop, just trying to make some money. The image that you're seeing is called the Piazza Navona. Many of you have been here before. And I think it's interesting too, because even today, Piazza Navona is so well known for painters and, maybe third-rate artists to do your portrait in the same way that it was in 1592 when Caravaggio was 20 years old. So he's kicking around in this area, the neighborhood of Piazza Navona, which he'll never leave while he's in Rome. He gets a place to live. He's living with a fellow whose name is Pandolfo Petruzzani, who Caravaggio gives a nickname to. He calls him Signor Insalata, which translates to Mr. Salad, because I guess Mr. Salad never gave Caravaggio anything to eat except for salad. But it does give you an idea of what Caravaggio was dealing with during these very poor days. This is an image in 1597, it's a little bit later, but I wanted you to see this because it's the kind of painting Caravaggio was doing in this early period. Today it's up in Milan, but it's the most astonishingly beautiful still life. And Caravaggio was doing this, what we call hack work, still lives, flowers, faces, working for people like this guy named Cavaliere d'Arpino, etc., trying to make a name for himself. But if you look at this, you can see the talent of Caravaggio. Look at that. Get in close and you can see the wormholes, the bruises, the slightly decayed leaves here and fruit. Yet it's a tour de force of naturalism. One feels like they can just reach out and pluck one of those delicious grapes. Notice as well the wilting leaves, the composition, and then backing up, just perched on the edge of the windowsill as if you could reach out and take it off. Remember, illusionism is a major characteristic of Baroque art. So this is Caravaggio in his early days, and then he's also, working like this. So this is his, again, it's an early work. It's called Boy Bitten by a Lizard, and it's in the National Gallery in London. And it's a fascinating work of a young boy who has just been bitten by a lizard. Let's see, I'll do a close-up so you can see where that lizard is. Right there. You can see unexpectedly the lizard has climbed out of the fruit and is biting that young boy right in the middle finger. Take a look at the fingers of the young boy. He needs to wash his hands. Take a look at the flowers here in this beautiful vase with light reflecting as if you can see the interior of Caravaggio's workshop. Back up and take a look at the expression of this beautiful boy. Is it a boy or is it a girl? He's got this cute little rose behind his hair. He's got a wonderful mess of curls like black whipped cream, a rather awkward shoulder here, and his full lips opened up in astonishment. What does this mean? It's a novel. This kind of genre is popular at this time up in Northern Europe, but not so much in Italy. It might be a symbol of the sense of touch. It could be symbolic of the pains of love after sensuous pleasure. It could be an allegory of some sort. And then one wonders, what was this boy doing before he was bitten by a snake? But this painting is important because it actually brings him to the attention to a major patron. And this man's name is Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. And he's living right in downtown, just off of the Piazza Navona. I put a picture here in the lower right of his palace. which I think is interesting. It's called the Palazzo Madama. This is actually today the Senate House of the Italian government, but originally belonged to Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, and who's very well connected. He was good friends with the Pope at this time, and he sees the talent of the young Caravaggio and invites him to come and live at the palace. And this is a big break for him because these artists, they have got to attach themselves to some money. Cardinal del Monte was quite notorious for pedophilia, and through many parties with young boys in this palace. And here's an idea of the kind of painting that Caravaggio does for Cardinal del Monte. Those of you who've been to the Borghese Gallery in Rome, you'll recognize this exquisite painting, which, as I said earlier, is a tour de force of still life. Look, should remind you of that basket of fruit I just showed you. Each grape perfectly delineated, the bruises, the marks, the wilting leaves, the basket. Caravaggio takes his genre of still life and applies it to these incredibly beautiful, beautiful young boys. And this is the kind of painting that Caravaggio is doing for Cardinal del Monte, or this. Many of you have been to Florence and you visited the Uffizi. And this is one of the most famous paintings at the Uffizi, which was done for Cardinal del Monte. It is the god Bacchus. Caravaggio gives us the god Bacchus, clearly taken from a model that Caravaggio will use over and over again. At first glance, it's supposed to represent the god Bacchus and his attributes. So we see, for example, the glass of wine being offered out to us. I invite you to lean in and look at the ripples on the surface of that goblet. Caravaggio's tour de force of the translucency, the elegant way Bacchus holds the glass with his little pinky finger held out, oh, so elegant. He's wearing a white toga. Once again, we're getting used to this. You see Caravaggio's bowl of fruit, ripe, ready to eat, succulent. But now I ask you to look a little bit more carefully at this boy. He's a strange boy, no? I mean, to me, he looks like a geisha girl. And notice as well how he pushes forward that shoulder, very sexy. He's toying with the sash to unveil his fruits above the fruits. I don't think it's lost on anyone what Caravaggio's hinting at here. But now I ask you to look a little bit more closely, and you'll see in the details over here on the left, there's a filthy pillowcase on the left-hand side. Whoever was a model for this was inside a very dirty studio that Caravaggio was painting from. Look at, again, the fingers that Caravaggio paints in this elegant pose. And you'll see they have filthy fingernails. Notice the red face of Bacchus and the white body. He has a farmer tan. And certainly most telling is the bowl of fruit, which you would never take a bite because it's filled with wormholes, bruises, and bursting with rot. This is an interesting painting, a moralizing painting that Caravaggio is painting for Cardinal del Monte. Well, in any case, if Caravaggio continues on this vein of these beautiful, yes, beautiful paintings, but remember, these are the paintings that they would see privately, he's never going to make a big name for himself. Finally, he makes a big name in the year 1599 when he gets a commission by a fellow named Matteo Contarelli inside a church in Rome. Many of you have visited, just off of the Piazza Navona, called San Luigi dei Francesi. It's the church for the French in Rome. And Caravaggio's commissioned to paint this, and it makes him famous throughout this work. And he becomes the most sought after artist in Rome because of this. Let's have a look. Caravaggio paints the scenes from the life of Saint Matthew, including this, which is called The Calling of Saint Matthew. And the story is Christ walks in, calls Matthew, and Matthew gets up and follows Christ and Peter. Matthew was a money changer. Now, let's see how Caravaggio puts this together. He has Matthew and his buddies seated around this table. And what are they doing? They are money grubbing. You just make out these figures on the lower left-hand side, counting the money. Notice also from this close-up, the costumes, the chairs, the way the sword comes into our picture plane. Notice as well how he's careful to show the figure from the back in this extraordinary tour de force of surface, bunching up the left-hand side of the composition, and then on our right, you can see who's just walked into the door, Christ and Peter. Here's Peter. He looks like he slept on a pillow the night before without brushing his hair, looks very naturalistic. And he steps inside. Behind him, you can see Christ, and Caravaggio's careful to illuminate him. Remember, the dramatic light is what's telling the story here. Notice very, very lightly in size, Caravaggio has painted a golden halo, almost invisible in the painting. The noble face of Christ. And what makes us move to left to right is, of course, this strong diagonal light that falls across Christ, over to this young bravo, this young boy, over to Matthew. He looks suspicious. Matthew points to himself as if to say, who, me? And this is Caravaggio really at his very best. He places a window in the upper right-hand side, almost as if to indicate that we've come into some kind of a tavern and come down the steps, and we're looking up at this dirty window. The composition is powerful and balanced, and he uses the light and the drama to move our eye across the composition. The hand of Christ, clearly, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio has looked back at his namesake and used the position of the hand of Michelangelo's creation of Adam as his inspiration for this image of the calling of Saint Matthew. Very powerful. Then on the other side of the chapel, he shows us the martyrdom of Saint Matthew, which at first glance is, the composition is very, very busy. You feel like you're in this tumultuous event. And I think that Caravaggio juxtaposes that very beautifully. The strong diagonal that very carefully leads us on the left-hand side. And then here, which looks like a cacophony of figures, but now look carefully, and you'll see that Caravaggio is using a kind of a pinwheel of composition, starting with this curve of this figure who is the assassin. Saint Matthew was assassin. They were in Syria, and he was going to baptize people. And one of the people waiting for baptism turned out to be a terrorist, and he jumps out and he's slaughtering people. That's why these kind of funny figures on the lower left-hand side are climbing out of something. See, and on the right-hand side, this character is seated on the edge of a baptismal pool. There's some steps back there, a little bit confusing. But here you can see it's like a pinwheel following from the body of the assassin up to the angel, to this young boy, across to Matthew, down the leg, to one of the people waiting for baptism, over to the left. And it turns your eye around the composition. Very, very clever. He also likes to put in details of figures in contemporary garb. Once again, we know that kid. That kid was just sitting at the table with Saint Matthew. And he even puts his own features. Can you see the man who's just peeking from the dark? That's a self-portrait of Caravaggio. This makes Caravaggio famous, and he starts getting commission after commission in Rome. He's working for the papal grooms, then he's working over at the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, and then he gets this fantastic composition, which is called The Supper at Emmaus, and this dates 1601. It's in London today at the National Gallery. So he's really riding this wave of fortune. And he takes this story, which is Christ who meets friends. They're having dinner at Emmaus, and then Christ will reveal to these two apostles that in fact he's the Son of God. Caravaggio gives us this moment just as he's revealed this. And it's the very instant that these two apostles realize that it's Jesus Christ. And their reaction is just marvelous. Okay, so let's read it. What Caravaggio does is he makes the figures enormous. These are life-size figures. The apostle on the left-hand side is astonished. He's just understood that it's Christ. He's taking the edge of his chair, ready to leap up. He's poor. You can see, for example, from the tear in his cloak, the patched up, and see how the light falls across his face. He's just seen the light. Then on the right-hand side, this has got to be James, because I can see he's wearing a cockle shell on his lapel. He reaches out, extends out in beautiful foreshortening that lets us step into the composition using these oversized figures. And here's Christ, again, a tour de force of one-point perspective. And this gesture is taken right from Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Christ here, an unusual Christ with no beard, rather puffy, but taken right from Michelangelo's Last Judgment to an overall. And you see the figure of the waiter that's come in, as if to say, when are you guys going to order? He's in shadow. He has not seen the light yet. He has not recognized. The whole thing is really incredibly theatrical, and it's cropped in an unusual way. Notice the way in the lower right-hand side, Caravaggio's left room for us to come and sit at the table. And right where we would pull up our chair, he's placed, of course, once again, his signature basket of fruit. You just want to reach out and push it back to the tip of the table so that it doesn't fall into your lap. So Caravaggio, at this point, 1601, riding this crest of fame and notoriety at this period. Trompe-l'oeil, still lives, criticized because the figure of Christ is not bearded, and also criticized because the fruit there is not fruit that is in season around Easter. But the criticism came from his biographer, Baldione, who was just jealous of him. So at this point, fame is really going to his head. And here we are back in Rome between 1602 and 1606. Caravaggio is famous, but he's constantly in trouble. His police record tells us that between 1602 and 1606, he's constantly being pulled in front of courts. He gets in trouble for walking around Rome with an unlicensed sword. He acts out in threatening ways. He gets hauled into the police for spending too much time watching young boys on a playground. He gets into scraps over prostitutes. At one point, he doesn't pay his rent, and when his landlady insists upon being paid, he throws stones at her head. And then in 1604, there's the famous incident where Caravaggio's with his friends at a tavern called Taverna del Moro, and he ordered artichokes for dinner. The Roman waiter came in with 4 artichokes. Caravaggio said which ones were cooked in butter and which ones were cooked in olive oil. And the waiter, typical Roman waiter, said, well, why don't you taste it and figure it out yourself? Caravaggio becomes irate, takes the boiling artichokes and throws them into the face of the waiter, who promptly goes off to call the police. Gives you an idea of the kind of impetuous nature. But it all comes to a head in, well, here are some of the figures, just to give you an idea. These are paintings by Caravaggio, giving you kind of an idea of what life was like in the Piazza Navona, the kind of people that he's consorting with, card players, bravi, they're called, fortune tellers, figures of ill repute, and Caravaggio belonged to the streets with these people. It all came to a head in the year 1606 when Caravaggio was having a tennis match with a nobleman's son. The nobleman's son's name was Ranuccio Tomassoni. Caravaggio lost the tennis match, became irate, took his trusty sword, and stabbed Tomassoni right in the femoral artery, and he bled to death. Now Caravaggio had committed murder, and the Pope put a price on his head. Rather than face murder charges, Caravaggio chose to flee. The Pope put a price on his head and said that the prize could be collected even if you brought the decapitated head of Caravaggio in a sack to him. Caravaggio's on the run. First place he goes, Naples. And he goes to Naples in 1606, looking for some shelter from a family called the Colonna, who were at odds with the papacy at this point. And for those of you who've been to Naples, one of my favorite places in the world, but it is confusing. Naples at the time was one of the most densely populated cities in all of Europe. And Caravaggio would have gone into this center of Naples and probably overwhelmed, but it was easy for him to get lost. And he does paintings in Naples, but this is the one I wanted to show you this evening. So he's painting away, he's working for the Colonna family, and here he paints something called the 7 Acts of Mercy. And this is right in downtown Napoli, right off the Spacca Napoli. And you go inside the Misericordia, which is like a hospital, a place to do good works, and you'll see the 7 Acts of Mercy. So what are the 7 acts? Burial of the dead, giving comfort to prisoners, feeding the hungry, giving people drink, shelter to pilgrims, clothing the naked, caring for the sick. And Caravaggio puts this together into one of the most interesting paintings and perhaps the first masterpiece of social realism. Let's look at some of these details. At the top, you can see the angel coming in, an angel coming in, 2 of them, doing like this incredible ballet. Look at the interesting position of those 2 angels. And of course, there's the Virgin Mary holding an adorable Christ child close to her. She's the Madonna della Misericordia, the Madonna of Mercy. Here, you can look and cope carefully and you see some of the acts. This character is drinking. And here, a character who's dressed in contemporary garb because he's one of the confraternity of the Misericordia. On the right-hand side, the character carrying the torch is bringing out the dead. See where you can just see the feet of this deceased man who's being buried. And then I guess my favorite is the detail here on the right-hand side, which shows you this young Neapolitan woman who's visiting a prisoner in jail and also giving him something to eat. It's a rather shocking image, isn't it? I know that woman. I've seen that woman in downtown Naples. I've seen her standing off and outside a Neapolitan coffee bar. Look at her face. The beautiful Neapolitan woman looking out as if to say, cosa vuoi? Voi che cosa guardi? Which means, what are you looking at? Why is this so astonishing as this elderly man gives something both shocking as well as realistic? And that's Caravaggio here in Naples. Well, he must have felt like he was under some kind of threat in Naples, because by 1608, he's on the run again. And he takes off. He's going to take off to a place where he's trying to find some protection, where the Pope's henchmen were not breathing down his throat. And he goes to, of all places, the island of Malta. And the island of Malta is controlled by a group of people called the Order of the Knights of St. John. And they will help people who are going off on a crusade. And Caravaggio goes there with two things in mind. Number one, he thinks he wants to get a knighthood. And next, because the Knights of Malta, of course, a religious order, he's hoping that he can get into their good graces and they might intervene for a papal pardon. Goes off to Malta on a boat, and he's going to meet this man. His name is Alof di Vignacourt, who is the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. And he comes under his good graces and his protection, and actually gets his knighthood. So Caravaggio is knighted by this man, which to me is just astonishing. And then Vignacourt this is at the Palazzo Pitti, by the way, for those of you who have been to the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. Then Vignacourt gives Caravaggio a commission to paint in the cathedral. The cathedral is dedicated to St. John. Here's the exterior. And here's the interior. This is the Baroque. Every inch is painted and gilded. It's exciting. Caravaggio comes in with all of this almost overwhelming luxury, and he paints this, which is called the Beheading of St. John. Again, like a bolt of lightning through the Baroque, Caravaggio gives us this painting, which is still in Malta, for those of you who might someday visit that island, which is well worth it. So St. John the Baptist, of course, St. John because the church is dedicated to St. John, and Salome will demand his head. And here, that moment, you can just see the moment that St. John is being decapitated. All right, let's look at the composition first. It's a huge painting, well over life size. So when you walk into the chapel to see this, you feel as if you're looking at a giant cinema, and it overwhelms you. It makes you feel like you're participating in this scene. The architecture helps anchor the figures as well. Caravaggio's using these strong geometric shapes, starting, of course, with this big arch on the left-hand side and the square over here, or rectangle, where these two observers are peeking in. We feel like we are observers just peeking into this incredibly gruesome moment of the head of the beheading of the head of St. John. Let's get in a little bit closer, or maybe we shouldn't. We should. Here's the maid who's taking this beautiful golden bowl, ready to pick up the head of St. John. This older maid holds up her hands in horror. The guard points to where the head should be placed. And the executioner here, strongly holding down St. John, who is just having his head removed. For the composition, circle around, and then a close-up. You can see the deadly knife. It's not really a knife, it looks more like a razor that's held in some kind of a sheath. The executioner looks bored. Tour de force of the treatment of the back. The jailer with all of his keys. And then down at the bottom, poor St. John, who has already received one slash in the neck. And it's as if the sword took off most of his head, and his executioner is taking the razor to finish up the work. Look at the difference in color of the face and the body of John to this ruddy character of the executioner. And most poignant, down at the bottom, where the blood comes pouring out of his neck, you can see that Caravaggio has painted in red blood his own name, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. Wow, this is Caravaggio at his best. Well, it seems that Caravaggio just couldn't stay out of trouble at this period, because at a certain point he gets in trouble with the Knights of Malta, has a fight with them, picked a fight with them, which is like picking a fight with hell's angels. And Caravaggio's got to flee Malta after being imprisoned. He somehow got his way out of prison, and now he's on the run. And now we are in the last act of Caravaggio's short life. He's going to go off to Sicily. This is a map of Sicily to give you an idea, and he'll make his way, first coming down to a place called Messina, then to Syracuse, to Palermo, making his way always with the Knights of Malta and the papal police on his heels. At one time in Syracuse, the Knights of Malta had caught up with him and grabbed him in a doorway and stabbed him or knifed him in the face. So things were brutal, and Caravaggio was on the run. The whole time he's on the run in Sicily, he's painting and painting very, very swiftly. I'd like to show you an example of one of his paintings from this period. This is called The Raising of Lazarus, 1609, and it's down in Messina. You can all see that Caravaggio's quickly painting. It looks impressionistic. The paint is laid on very, very quickly. He's changing his style, not the careful delineation of the composition and the layering of the colors to make them look three-dimensional. Instead, there's a looseness. It looks almost like a Titian in this case, or what we'll see with the Impressionists. Now, I don't think Caravaggio's changing his style. I honestly think he just doesn't have time. And he's on the run, and he's painting these things as quickly as possible, tossing them to people as if to say, take the painting, leave me alone. And this one, called The Raising of Lazarus, is one of my favorites. Notice, for example, how he leaves the whole upper section of this painting unfinished with just shadows here and there, indicating some kind of architecture in the background. Highly unusual. He places the figures down at the bottom of the picture plane. Raising of Lazarus, you'll remember the story. Christ raises Lazarus, who is the brother of Mary and Martha. He had been in the sepulcher for 3 days. It's a precursor to Christ, of course, and Christ will raise him. The image of Christ is quite vertical with the horizontal treatment of his arm. Have a look. Reminding us again of the gesture of Michelangelo's creation of Adam. Behind Christ, you can see these figures taken from everyday life. He's trying to get a look, this character on the far left-hand side. These others are straining to pull the top of the sepulcher off. They're in astonishment, and the color plays across the picture plane beautifully. Now let's take a look at the image of Lazarus, who's still in rigor mortis. You see his hand wide open, his eyes bulging out, this really wonderful juxtaposition of his sister and Lazarus and them coming together. He looking with these eyes just coming to life, and the sister looking down pitifully. That's quite a strong painting by Caravaggio, and one that is unusual because clearly he is on the run. Caravaggio must have caught wind that there might be a papal pardon afoot. So he wants to get closer. He leaves the island of Sicily and he makes his way back to Naples in 1607, hiding out in Naples. And that's when he paints this, which is called David with the Head of Goliath. And I bring this up because he paints this painting and then he dispatches it to Rome. And he sends it to a guy named Scipione Borghese, who was the nephew of the Pope. And the idea, friends, is that Caravaggio is trying to appease the people in Rome so that he can get a papal pardon. And it's got this interesting flip because David, right, who slays Goliath, and then Caravaggio, if you look carefully, used his own features for the face of Goliath. Horrific. Look at the swollen eyes. The great care that he's taken to show this wound in the middle of his head. His mouth open, teeth just showing. This is a portrait of Caravaggio. And then let's go back to David, who to me almost looks hitting down to the face and the head of Goliath. Feels a little bit sorry. He doesn't look like a victorious David that we'd see with Donatello or Michelangelo or even Bernini. This is a David who is quite poignant, thoughtful, considering the condition of Goliath, in the same way that I think Caravaggio was hoping that the Pope would consider his condition. Well, we are in the last act. At this point, Caravaggio leaves Naples. He must have caught wind that there was a pardon on the horizon. He gets on a boat and he heads to Rome. For some reason, and we still don't know exactly why, the boat doesn't go straight to Rome. It goes about 100 kilometers north of Rome to a place called Porto Ercole. And we presume it was on that boat from Rome to Porto Ercole, which is in southern Tuscany, that Caravaggio may have contracted malaria. And he comes to Porto Ercole because the boat docks it. Porto Ercole at this point has nothing, no redeeming qualities. It's famous at the period for sardines, bad wine, and of course, mosquitoes. When the boat docks, 2 Spanish soldiers who were protecting the port grabbed Caravaggio. It was a case of misidentification, and they threw him into a prison. They found out it wasn't that the Spanish soldiers weren't on the side of the Pope. They just mistakenly believed that Caravaggio was the man that they were looking for, and they threw him into a Spanish prison. 2 days later, they let him free, understanding that he wasn't indeed the guy they were looking for. And Caravaggio was already very ill and irate. And according to the story, Caravaggio leaves the prison, rushes to the shore, only to see his boat already sailing away, carrying all of his worldly possessions, his books, his paintings, his trusty sword, and Caravaggio was left with nothing on the beaches of Porto Ercole. He began to march up and down in the hot midday sun until he collapsed and he died of rage and fever, all by himself, alone, just the way he lived. He had no money, no friends, no family, and he died, he was not even 39 years old. 3 days later, the papal pardon arrived and Caravaggio would have been freed. I can't leave you on that last note because Caravaggio, even though he had no followers and no friends, will leave a legacy for his short 39 years, 1571 to 1610, to artists that I'm sure many of you will recognize. Artemisia Gentileschi, the Dutch Hansworst, known as the Caravaggeschi, Guido Reni from Bologna, Rembrandt, Dutch, Valentine, French, and even the great Velázquez, the Spanish artist. All of these artists will owe a debt of gratitude to the notorious Caravaggio. And with that, we've explored the life and times of Caravaggio, one of the most fascinating of all the artists of the 17th century, and one of the most influential. So at this point, we have 5 minutes left. I will conclude by saying that these art history encounters I do once a week on Sunday evenings. If any of you would like to join, you're more than welcome. You simply send me an email to my website. I think Kevin has put it up there, but many of you have my website address from the response I gave you. If you missed that response, it's elaineruffolo.com, and you can sign up this coming Sunday, for example, which is today's Thursday. This coming Sunday, Art History Encounters has a special presentation, 8 o'clock at night, Florence time, the same time, but Sunday evening. My friend and colleague Ross King, famous author of Brunelleschi's Dome and Michelangelo the Pope's Ceiling, will be co-presenting the story of Leonardo da Vinci. And if you'd like to join that, you are, again, more than welcome. And you can see, I'm going to continue on, as long as people have interest. It honestly fills my soul that all of you are interested in art and architecture. So thank you very much.